Man and Animal Question, is man just another natural species? Extract from the book, The Little Larousse of Philosophy, written by Hervé Boileau. Introduction. Is man just another natural species? The subject is formulated in such a way as to suggest that only a considerable reduction in what made man would allow us to consider him as just another species. Not that human beings, as living beings, don't belong to nature in general, in the same way as trees or animals. The question is rather how to view them. Some believe that anthropology has too quickly made men an exception within nature. For example, certain radical thinkers in the field of ecology, while denouncing the destructive capacity of human activities, also challenge, on a deeper philosophical level, the predominant place that man has attributed to himself in nature, and intend to put him back in his place in the biosphere, alongside living beings such as animals, who could very well be endowed with the same rights as he is, and be able to claim the same respect. We haven't reached that point yet, but one of our current challenges may well be to ask whether we can still maintain, on a philosophical level, a clear and decisive demarcation between the universe of man and that of nature in general. Can nature encompass man without absorbing him? Part 1. Man as a natural species, the thesis and its difficulties even today. The idea that man is just another natural species smacks of sulfur. We can guess at the sacrilegious scope of this idea, the lifting of the religious taboo according to which God made man in his own image. The question of man's status in nature is first and foremost a theological one, and we can't forget it, even when we claim to settle it scientifically. It's easy to understand why Darwin's theory of the evolution of species, 1809-1882, caused such a scandal when it first appeared in 1859, with its philosophical presupposition of continuity between the animal and human worlds. To take the measure of the revolution that was taking place here, let's recall that naturalists still believed not long before that there are as many different species as the infinite being created them in the beginning. Lynn, 1707, 1778. Before Darwin, at the beginning of the 19th century. Lamarck, 1744, 1829, had already shaken this vision of things by proposing an evolutionary explanation of species. They appeared little by little over time, instead of being created simultaneously, and became more complex each time. This evolutionary model not only allowed us to consider men as the chronological end of this growing complexity, but also highlighted the continuity between what had previously been distinguished, the animal kingdom, and that of man. The thesis of man's exceptionality was at an end. Philosophers had already asked these questions. While none had openly defended the idea of equal status between men and the rest of nature, some had modified the boundaries between humanity and animality. Condillac, for example, a contemporary of Rousseau, did not hesitate to argue in favor of an understanding, a will, and even a language in animals, in his Trait de Animo, 1755. If we grant animals sentience, then we must also, says the author, grant them the capacity to judge, which is explained by the simple sensitive ability to compare sensations with each other, and to remember them. Condillac's position is interesting, because it makes it possible to affirm the continuity between man and animal, while maintaining a qualitative difference between the two. It is possible to explain the superior by the inferior, without cancelling out the difference. It would be good to remember this when some would like to use the scientific theory of the evolution of species to deny any distinction between humanity and animality. That one proceeds from the other does not imply that one is the other. Thus, man's originally animal state does not account for the fact that, in the course of their evolution, humans have succeeded in overcoming primitive animality and constituting a cultural universe, of which art, religion, and language are but a few examples. There are scarcely two argumentation strategies: either we draw the animal towards man, or we draw man towards the animal. The first way often highlights the language of dolphins or bees, the fact that certain animals use tools, or that they transform their environment, like the beaver that builds dams. Other species even seem to give up on life, as the frequent stranding of whales on beaches, which sensationalist journalists are quick to describe as suicide, would tend to prove. But despite these facts, animal societies have no culture. On the contrary, the distance that man has progressively put between himself and nature, transmitted from one generation to the next, has accumulated to form a history. The second way, often used by scientists, is to draw man closer to the animal. Explanations of humans in terms of their chemical components, and in particular the neurobiological explanation of their intellectual performance, tend to think of the difference between humans and animals in terms of pluses and minuses, rather than as an essential difference. Thus, the human brain is only more complex than that of the animal. Where animals respond very quickly to a stimulus, human response times are longer, resulting in a certain indeterminacy of behavior. So far, there's nothing to say, and once again, there's no reason to criticize the idea of continuity from animal to human, and only quantitative differences between them. At the strictly cognitive level, which is that of explanatory continuity, we'll probably never be able to say anything different. So it's hardly surprising that scientists are increasingly establishing this. On the other hand, it's no longer science but philosophy to interpret this relative indeterminacy of human behavior as being responsible for an illusory belief in human freedom. Some scientists have a tendency to move insensitively from the explanation of a particular human faculty or behavior by natural causes, to the more systematic idea of a natural determinism that would account for the whole of the human being, just as it is sufficient to account for the animal. Like laboratory rats, stress makes us aggressive, failure or success encourages or discourages us, and we end up dissolving all freedom in this generalized explanation by natural causes. And yet, it seems that it is here, around the notion of freedom, that the question of the relationship between men and the rest of nature hinges. That the difference between them is merely quantitative in the eyes of scientific knowledge of men is not compatible with the principle of a rupture, which alone can account for the ethical reality of humanity, its capacity to act not naturally, but freely. Here again, the debate is philosophical before it is scientific. In the 17th century, a philosopher like Spinoza opposed the belief that man is in nature like an empire within an empire. Man, he says, is a part of nature, not an exception to it. Man and his conduct can be sufficiently explained by natural causes, and only ignorance of these causes can sustain the illusion that men are free, in the sense that, alone in nature, they enjoy the power of self-determination, free will. The man who believes himself to be free is, according to him, comparable to the stone who believes himself free to fall, or to the drunkard who speaks out of turn, persuaded to say what he wants when all he's doing is talking under the influence and command of alcohol. For all that, Spinoza does not deny human freedom, or the possibility of human beings being free. While they are part of nature, they have their own way of being, which they do not share with any other species. The fact that everything about man, his passions, his thoughts, and his behavior, can be explained by natural causes, psychological or biological, for example, in no way prevents him from being the only one capable of leading a free life, a life led under the guidance of reason. As part of nature, it can be explained, like everything else, by its natural causes, but it is also as part of nature that it has the power to live freely. Explanatory continuity is perfectly compatible with the ethical break introduced by humanity. Transition. So it is at the very moment when it seems that the boundary between men and the rest of nature is, after all, no more than a difference of degree that the irreducible specificity of men is in fact asserted, for philosophical analysis. Part 2. Human Specificity, History and Freedom. Jean-Jacques Rousseau, a French writer and philosopher, set out, in the simplest terms, the decisive features of humanity that forever distinguish it from the natural universe. First and foremost, man is a free agent. Rousseau is ready to concede to Descartes that man, as an animal, is no more than an ingenious machine, with the difference that he chooses or rejects not by instinct, but by an act of freedom. The beast cannot deviate from the rule prescribed by nature. In a justly famous text, taken from the Discourse on Inequality, Rousseau illustrates this strikingly. Thus a pigeon would starve near a pond filled with the best meats, and a cat on a heap of fruit or grain, though either could feed very well on the food it disgorged. On the contrary, men can deviate from the prescribed rule. It would even be more accurate to say that nature does not subject him to any rule so binding that he cannot turn it or exempt himself from it. As far as man is concerned, although it's true that he's a natural being, nature doesn't act as a norm. Whether in matters of sexuality, diet or, more generally, lifestyle, nature in no way constitutes the criterion for good or normal conduct. It is precisely because nature does not dictate conduct that man can be considered a moral being. His morality lies in the deviation he makes from any natural rule, but also in the fact that he can always deviate from the norms of his society, to test his freedom by transgressing prohibitions or recommendations. Since nature is not the norm, the notions of right and wrong, just and unjust, can take on meaning for him. These notions are not natural, they are political, they exist only in a society. Spinoza saw this clearly. Man is capable, while seeing how to do things well, of doing things badly, of being evil, of harming others as well as himself. A case in point is the smoker who, knowing he has lung cancer, continues to smoke at the risk of his own death. We could also evoke the ultimate case of suicide, where some have seen the highest, yet most haughty, affirmation of human freedom in the act of renouncing adherence to one's own life. To say that man is a moral being is therefore to agree that, while he is determined, biologically, for example, as long as we see him in terms of a natural reality, his relationship to norms is, on the other hand, indeterminate. Good acting or bad acting are the two poles of a morality that will never have the necessity of a natural law. We could even radicalize the idea by saying that human beings, unlike all others, are anti-natural beings. Its nature is not to have one. Precisely because there is no human nature, humanity is defined by its ethical dimension alone. This is how Rousseau always saw slavery, as the very negation of humanity. To decree that a man would not be born free is to decree that he would not be born a man. Another consequence is that man is capable of being far superior to the beast, but also of falling further than it. Certain particularly odious acts of cruelty are repugnant to us, and remind us that the human, having no essence fixed once and for all, always virtually contains the inhuman. This is inevitable if man is indeed a being of anti-nature. Such ideas bring us closer to the existentialism of Sartre, 20th-century French philosopher and writer, for whom man exists before being characterized by any particular essence. To exist is not to live a merely vegetative life, to grow, develop, preserve and reproduce. To exist is to break with the ties that bind us to all. Determination, especially natural ones. Man exists first, that is to say, man is first of all what throws himself towards a future, man is first of all a project, and will be first of all what he plans to be. Sartre is perhaps the philosopher who went furthest in asserting that there is no human nature, but that man is a being of anti-nature. If man is not a natural species, we can no longer, strictly speaking, divide the human race into species and subspecies, which would be the races. The very concept of race implies, whether we like it or not, a racist doctrine according to which the essence of man is to be Jewish, white or black. To classify people by race is to confine them to an improbable essence. Cultural traits are then considered natural, and thus begins the negation of the culture of the other, called barbarians, primitive or subhuman. Racist doctrines, because they consider men in terms of nature, always carry with them, virtually or explicitly, as in the case of Nazi racism, the denial of the other man's humanity. Conversely, these remarks reveal another distinctive feature of the human being, the ability to rise to the universal beyond all ethnic or cultural particularisms. This capacity for the universal, or cosmopolitan, is also constitutive of what we have called human morality. Finally, we'll borrow one last element from Rousseau, which, according to this author, definitively sets man apart from the rest of living beings, what he called perfectibility. Perfectibility refers to the ability to perfect oneself. An animal is at the end of a few months what it will be all its life, and its species is at the end of 1,000 years the same as on the first day of those 1,000 years. To say, on the contrary, that man is perfectible is to say that he is doomed to change, and that he will only be fully himself at the end of that change. For both the individual and the species, such change is the work of education. As Kant asserts, man is the only creature who must be educated. Humanity, then, is not a given, it is achieved and conquered through ceaseless effort. Human space only becomes itself once it has been stripped of its native naturalness. To say that man is the only creature that needs to be educated does not necessarily mean denying that there is a human nature, or at any rate that there are natural dispositions in man. Think of the disposition to speak, specific to the human species. This would mean that the development of natural dispositions in men does not occur spontaneously. This last idea is undoubtedly the one that best accounts for human duality, that humanity stands entirely on the level of naturalness, but also entirely on the ethical level, where man is never all that he should be. Conclusion: the question of whether or not man is simply a natural species is, for many, simply a way of looking at things. Depending on whether we insist on continuity or discontinuity between the animal world, and the natural world in general, and the human universe, we will be tempted to answer the question differently. The fact remains that, while it is legitimate to assume continuity in the order of scientific explanation, it cannot be generalized to the point of considering man as a simple natural species. To do so would be to neglect not only his cultural dimension, but also his ethical vocation.